Oops. Okay. Um, I didn't share my screen. Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is going to be the lecture, Breaking Barriers. We're going to be talking about critical arguments that relate to identity, how they relate to both the affirmative and negative side in public forum debate. I'm Sean Wallace from Sidwell, here with Anya and Tang from Exeter. We ran a critique together at Georgetown Public Forum, and now Anya is off to do LD. Okay. Yeah, take it away.
All right, yeah. So before we start with the lecture about Ks, it is probably good to understand what is K and why are people reading Ks in the first place. So a K, or critique, is German for the word criticism. There are many different suggestions as to why we call it a critique. I think the most commonly accepted assumption is just that judges needed a way to distinguish between RFD criticisms and critiques as an argument. So a critique is a criticism of behavior. It can be a critique of our epistemology or the ways in which we produce knowledge. It can critique our ethics, our impacts. It is just another type of argument that presents a different way of viewing the world and challenges us to engage in this current world in different ways. And so the reason as to why we read Ks is to challenge how we engage with many different parts of the world, i.e. with the debate, with the space, or with the topic. It is also probably good to start with a brief history lesson. All of this is very reductionist, and I would urge y'all to go out and do reading on your own about the history of the K, but it is most important to remember that the K begins in college policy debate in the late 90s, the early 2000s, where it is becoming more prevalent in college circuits, although not under the word critique. Debaters are reading philosophical arguments, they're reading counterplans with very philosophical evidence. Most prominently, there are four people, Daryl Birch and Eddie Warner, who are coaching at the University of Louisville. They're urging their debaters to read more performative arguments and bring in different pieces of evidence, i.e. from their own personal experiences or from organic intellectuals, which are like rap artists or counter-hegemonic figures, i.e. people who we don't traditionally read in the debate space, people who are not traditionally old white authors like Nick Bostrom, who have devoted their entire life's work to studying how certain policy actions result in certain things. On the other hand, we also study Bill Shanahan and Shane Stafford, who begin to coach K teams around this time. They urge them to read arguments that are very rooted in philosophy and questioning different power structures. Most prominently, however, is the Louisville Project, where Coach Eddie Warner teaches his teams to read performance debate. And so we hear this a lot, where we hear this phrase, debate is a game. And so it is always really important to consider how does Louisville engage with this, because it really sets the foundation for our understandings of performance debate and why we perform in the space. Most prominently, it is because at the time, and still today, debate is not a space normatively or institutionally created for non-white debaters, especially not for the majority low-income Black debaters who went to the University of Louisville. And so a lot of these performances discussed how we can't change the state, but we can still change the state of debate, which is really the central philosophy of the Louisville Project, where debaters utilized different frameworks of knowledge production, such as utilizing organic intellectuals, personal experiences, and academic intellectuals to shape a debate case that discusses the ways in which their personal identities interact with both debate space and with their authors and their conceptions, i.e. debaters would play rap as a way to reframe the way they understood war rhetoric or discussions of war and policymaking simulations. Yeah, and so most notably, we see on our top right, Ryan Walsh and Elijah Smith. They're two Black queer K debaters and the first people in history to do what is called Uniting the Crowns, which is winning the two most prestigious college policy tournaments in one season. The reason why their victory was so important was because A, it set a precedent in the space that both performance and K debate had a space in this place and could continue winning and continue being a very powerful method of self-advocacy. But also B, it was an important victory in that it was the first time any two Black debaters had broken past octafinals of the National Debate Tournament, which is one of the two most important college policy tournaments at the time. And so if y'all have time after this lecture, I strongly urge that y'all take a look at the 2013 NDT2AR on YouTube. Just search up 2013 NDT Emporia SW. Ryan Walsh gives the 2AR, and his speech is one of the most impactful case speeches I've ever been able to listen to. Even if you don't understand a lot of the terminology, it is still very, very important in shaping and understanding how we interact with performances in K-debate and why these things are so important. So moving forward in 2020, we see that the K has become a lot more prevalent in high school spaces, especially policy and LD. We see it's becoming increasingly prevalent in PF, and we're continuing from here where we have a lot of literature behind us and a lot of history behind us and a lot more to move forward to.
Also, Ryan Walsh did a really cool radio lab. That's a really good listen. You should listen to that as well. Okay, I'm going to kind of talk about how critical arguments relate to the affirmative side of the debate. One thing to keep in mind is we're talking about this in the context of public forum, where there isn't a huge history of critical debate. A lot of the history of critical debate comes from policy and LD, where the format is very different, i.e. the affirmative always speaks first, and the affirmative chooses the plan, which means the affirmative gets to pick what the debate is going to be about. In public forum, it is not like that. There are no plans, and the affirmative can speak second. But the structure of a critical affirmative from the policy and LD can still kind of shape how we write critical affirmatives in public forum. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is the structure of the critical affirmative. So you might be thinking, well, if the affirmative speaks first, what are they criticizing? The other team hasn't said anything yet. Well, what teams on the affirmative do in critical arguments is they think about something a bit larger to criticize. Usually it is either debate as an activity, the debate space, or something about the topic that they are criticizing. So how do they criticize that? It is usually through a performance, an advocacy, or both, usually both. So what is a performance when it relates to debate? Usually it means that it is quite literally a performance of something. Your speech act, i.e. giving a 1AC, is a performance, but a lot of teams will do something more. They will read a poem, they will tell a story, give a personal narrative. There are even teams that will, there were college policy teams, I believe, that did dance in the 1AC. A performance can be anything, any kind of narrative that you think is important to bring into the debate round. Now, what is an advocacy? This is the most important part, in my opinion, of the critical affirmative. Essentially, a critical affirmative cannot be descriptive. You can't just say racism exists and it's bad. You need a method or an advocacy for what you are doing to dismantle structures that create whatever you are critiquing, be it racism, queerphobia, etc. For example, an affirmative that Joshua Porter, who was an LD debater from Straight Red last year, was about taking debate hostage, taking the 1NC hostage. He said that ruptures the debate space to fight anti-Blackness in the debate space. The next part of the critical affirmative is going to be your offense. How does this differ from typical public forum offense? So these are essentially the supporting arguments to your advocacy and your theory of power. The theory of power is a very important concept. It is what you think the world looks like, what structures of power you think exist, are oppressive, and what you are critiquing, what you are trying, or maybe not even trying to destroy, but what you are critiquing. So you will have offense that supports your theory of power, what you think the world looks like, and your advocacy or your method, what your affirmative does, basically. The next part of the critical affirmative is the rule of the ballot. This is also extremely, extremely important. It essentially tells the judge how to view the round. If you watch critical rounds online, a lot of times the first question in cross, which is really, really annoying, is what does the AF do? Well, the role of the ballot, to a certain extent, says why the AF matters. It says what the AF does. You are telling the judge why they shouldn't be voting for, like, I don't know, the government passing a no first use policy, why they should be affirming your performance, your advocacy, your critical affirmative. Now let's kind of talk about how to write a critical affirmative. So, what's really cool about critical arguments is that you kind of make debate your own. Anything that you've ever wanted to talk about but haven't been able to can go into your critical affirmative, i.e., when we wrote ours for Georgetown, which is on the wiki under Sidwell, um, we wanted to kind of write about how queer phobia has impacted us specifically in the debate space. So we wrote personal narratives of that. We talked about our personal experiences and we performed those in the form of narrative storytelling. What's really important to remember here is that your personal narratives are evidence. What your experiences are true to you. They're your experiences with structures of power within the debate space, which is why they're evidence. Another thing is you should read a lot. You should read a lot of critical literature. There are millions of books and PDFs and articles, maybe not millions, but there's a lot of books out there that talk about structures of power in the world. What various structures of power in the world look like, what various forms of oppression look like, what is queerness, what does queer phobia look like, what does it mean to be black, what is anti-blackness, etc. Reading a lot will allow you to understand literature bases or groups of authors who have a similar theory of power, a heuristic of the world, and it will help you to understand everything about your K in order to defend it. You should also think about how your identity has been impacted by the space. If you want to write a critical argument about identity, thinking about how your identity, going back to the example of queer phobia in the debate space, has impacted you specifically in debate. Um, You should also, I didn't put this on the slide, but you should also kind of think about what might be wrong with the topic. A lot of critical affirmatives don't necessarily criticize the debate space as much as they criticize the topic, why discussions of maybe why the discussions of a certain topic are exclusionary, why they are violent, etc. A really good way to learn about how to write critical affirmatives, how to read critical affirmatives, is just lectures online. VBI has a series of lectures that are fantastic for free on YouTube. Um, my personal favorite is called Winning with a Critical Affirmative by Brianna Aaron. It's fantastic. Yeah. You can also check out OpenEv, the College High School Policy LD wikis, um, which are basically massive online databases full of files, evidence, everything you need to learn about critical arguments. You can see other critical affirmatives that other people have read. Um, yeah. So just a few things to keep in mind when writing a critical affirmative. The first, again, what is your theory of power? This is like really, really, really important. What does the world look like in your opinion? What structures exist? What structures are oppressive? Painting a picture of what the world looks like is going to be the most important part of the critique, because if you remember, we are criticizing assumptions. We are criticizing maybe epistemic biases. So you need to prove to the judge that the way that they look at the world is incorrect. They should be looking at the world from X perspective. Is your app germane to the topic? Um, Generally, you want to have some kind of relation to the topic, at least to mention it. Otherwise, teams will just be like, why are you reading this? What structures does your app criticize? This goes back to the theory of power. What are you actually criticizing here? Do you understand your lit base and are your authors contradictory? Like I said, you will need to read a lot of literature to write a critical affirmative. You need to understand what your authors are actually saying, what their theory of power is, and just to make sure that your authors aren't contradictory. For example, if you're reading a queer theory critique, you do not want to read Edelman and Munoz because they hate each other and they have very, very different perspectives on the world. Maybe they don't hate each other, but their views are contradictory. It is even a good idea sometimes to read one author to make sure that they're not contradictory with each other.
Yeah, so once you've figured out, or at least gotten a beginning of how to write a KF, it is also probably important to figure out how to answer a KF, both so you can frontline if you so want to answer or to read a KF, but also if you end up hitting a KF, you can learn how to engage with it. The first method is through topicality or framework arguments, or just general theory layer arguments, where we discuss both the content of the AF as well as the form of the AF. Topicality discusses the content of the AF and explains why it's a good idea to be topical, why it's a good idea to talk about things like nuclear policy. Framework discusses the form in which the AF presents itself or in which the AF performs. Framework suggests things like why discussing hypothetical policy action or why implementing plans through the USFG is a good idea. One common argument is the TDA, which stands for a topical version of the AF. It is a question of, could this KF team have read their AF while being topical? One example is on, for example, the federal jobs guarantee topic for LD. We can make this argument that a KF about destroying the world would be untopical, but affirming the resolution, affirming a federal jobs guarantee as a way to collapse the US economy and then the global economy as a result is probably a topical way to access that same impact. Or maybe not, there's different arguments to make here. But yeah, framework and topicality / other theory arguments generally say it's a good idea for the AF to either adhere to a certain form of debate or why the AF specific model of debate is bad or flawed. Some debaters will have this stance where T framework is violent or otherwise another method of policing. I personally agree with it. I personally am tired of y'all reading T framework in public forum. But I also understand that it is a part of the toolbox for answering chaos. And so I think it is still important to learn about T framework. A lot of K debaters will also read T framework on the neg. It is an important argument to learn about. On method indicts, the neg can also say that the AF's method or the AF's performance is bad for whatever reason. Either it doesn't accomplish the initial goal that they set out to accomplish, or it is harmful in other ways. For example, the act of playing music can be argued to be commodified or a bad method, or it can be inaccessible to people who are unable to listen to music and flow the one at the same time. We can say that their method can get co-opted by the state, or that their method doesn't actually create a set of resistance for XYZ reasons. Or we can even do things like author indicts, where we say that the AF's authors, that their scholarship is bad or should not be relied on for XYZ reasons, or that their authors have really morally flawed positions, i.e. Baudrillard, who is a very common semio-capitalism author, was also a raging sexist. We can make this argument that we shouldn't be reading sexist authors in this space or that we shouldn't be defending sexist advocacies. We can also reject their theory of power. We can say that the way the AF views the world, the way the AF frames things is flawed. Maybe their claims of ontology about things, about the existence and the nature of things existing is flawed or untrue for XYZ reasons. But yeah, at the end of the day, just to treat a KF like a normal argument. A KF is like a regular argument with a regular chain of claims and warrants and theories of power and ideas of how the world works. And so arguing that the AF isn't enough to overcome whatever theory of power it is discussing, or that the AF is harmful for XYZ reasons, are all different ways to constructively attack a KF. This isn't on the slide, but I'm really tired of hearing it. If any of y'all make this claim about going to about how PFers who read Ks should go to LD or CX, I would say please save it for another round. I really think it's unconstructive. This is the only argument where I'll ever take a concrete stance on, aside from maybe T framework. There are plenty of other ways you can engage with the KF constructively and respectfully, and telling someone to leave the event is probably not the best way to do it. But yeah, I think that's my 30-second spiel on KFs.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about KNEGs. A KNEG is pretty similar to a DA, albeit with the addition of an alt. Let's start first with the link. So a KNEG has a connection to the critique and to the case. This can operate on many different layers. It is essentially what is being challenged or indicted. It can be something as specific as lines in the 1AC or lines in crossfire that the 1AC is saying or defending to show how the critique links, i.e. the affirmative can explicitly say, we are defending the free market, or we think things like economic growth are the only solution or the best solution for global poverty. Those can be links to a critique that challenges capitalism. There are also topic level links about how a topic specifically is flawed or should be challenged. There are links to the AF's method, i.e. if the AF uses policymaking as a way to achieve a solution, we can say that policymaking is bad or harmful. Additionally, there are also critiques linking to performances in the debate space, i.e., the usage of gendered language or the action of something problematic, such as like, um, yeah, or just like making like problematic assumptions in the 1AC. Additionally, on a K, there's also an impact, which are usually implicated into the real world, i.e., things like war or structural violence. We can argue that capitalism creates unsustainable growth, or capitalism puts us on the track to extinction. And so it is probably better that we say something or do something about it instead of just accepting the AF or encouraging and enabling the AF's flawed relationship to capitalism. One really important thing to consider is that on K debate, there is less focus on fiated plans or fiated advocacies than there is in topical or just like very LARP util debate. And so what this means is that we cannot weigh this like cap impact against the case's impacts of things like Iranian nuclear war, for example, because those impacts of Iranian nuclear war rely on the AF using fiat to pass its imaginary policy. And when we discuss the K, we're discussing things like your epistemology or the framework in which you produce knowledge and accept things as fact. And so these things operate on different layers. We need to evaluate the impact of the K and whether or not the K is true or not before we can evaluate things like case and whether or not the case is a good idea. Because the critique is attacking why we think the case is a good or bad idea. Yeah, and then on the alt level, alt stands for alternative. It is essentially what we want to do or advocate for instead of the case to solve. What this does is an alt will give the K uniqueness because otherwise a K functions as a relatively non-unique disad, right? Like the AF perpetuates capitalism. Capitalism is bad for XYZ reasons, right? Like now what? We need this alternative to provide some sort of offense for the neg to go for, and we need to explain to the judge essentially what we should be doing instead of the case. So this can look like things like advocating for historical materialism or viewing the AF through a class-based lens. It can advocate for things like starting a communist party or engaging in vanguardism to provide a remote foundation, like to provide a stable foundation from which we can attack or dismantle capitalism. Generally, like I would say that in terms of advocacies, because PF is the only event compared to LD and CX that bans counterplans, there is some layer of theory to be had here as to whether or not people are allowed to read Ks. You can probably read a shell saying that people shouldn't get counter advocacies in PF or that the neg shouldn't get any advocacies other than status quo. I don't really have any opinions on that, but I think like at the end of the day, whether or not PF gets to advocate for a KL is still like very much debatable. But yeah, the alt is
Yeah.
usually just an action of refusal or an urging to adopt some other course of action other than the case.
Yeah, another thing about alts is like a lot of teams will say in public forum, you can't do that. That's a counter plan. Relatively easy way to get around that. What a lot of teams do is say that the alternative is to reject the other team or something along those lines. A lot of times with a critique, you can say, you're not voting for me as much as you're voting against them. At that point, you're not necessarily fiating anything. Secondarily, I would say that like Anya said, when we talk about Ks, we kind of have to a certain extent get away from the idea of fiat. A lot of times alts are like moral alignments, right? So it's not necessarily like you're saying like um I don't know. Like it's a moral alignment. It's not necessarily that the neg is fiating something here. So there is definitely a debate to be had on whether or not um it is or isn't allowed. Okay.
Yeah, so here's some case relating to identity. There's still many, many more beyond these, but these are just some that come to mind immediately. For example, in terms of gender, there's argument to be made about the FemK or about the FemIRK, which urges us to look at IR or international relations through a feminist lens. I think if you're looking for some examples from the 2019 PF Wiki, LaSalle CH reads this at the TOC. It is a really, yeah, it's a really amazing argument, lots of really good literature on it. It discusses the ways in which patriarchy influences the ways we understand international relation, along with the role in which gender might have to do with that. Yeah, and so another really large body of literature is about queer theory, where we discuss the relationship that queer bodies have in really in relation to the state. We can say things like state policymaking is bad or harmful because it excludes queer people, or we can say that certain performances or certain methods are good for queer bodies or bad for queer bodies, or that we should be advocating for a more pessimistic theorization of power, which is that state policies or that this world, the social order, will never be reformed or will never show enough progress to liberate queer people. And then lastly, we also have a large body of literature having to deal with critical race theory and with racial positionality. This includes arguments like Afro-pessimism, or a larger body of literature like anti-Blackness, model minority, Asian melancholy. These are just different theorizations of power of which we understand how race works, or how we view and understand and interact with race. And so these critiques, a lot of what they share in common is that they have a very unique theorization of power that might disagree with other bodies of Kalit or might even challenge other bodies of Kalit directly. But what we do understand is that each critique has its own unique way of theorizing how the world works or how people exist and how people produce knowledge.
Yeah, really quickly, there were a couple things I wanted to add that I forgot to put on the slides. One, another large body of literature that a lot of people read as a criticism um, is critiques about settler colonialism. Uh, Anya, actually, do you want to speak to that since you like have more experience?
Sure, yeah. People will read critiques about settler colonialism or about the ways in which um, the affirmative and the USFG specifically are settler colonial powers. They are settlers. They have come onto this land with the intent of replacing and eradicating the indigenous population. Um, and we must understand and find a method to challenge and resist settler colonialism. Um, I think Eve Tuck and KW Yang are both really great authors for this sort of body of literature. But yeah, Set Call is also really big body of literature to look through and read on.
Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to say was just be careful about what you read, especially with these kinds of arguments. It's really important to genuinely read the literature. Like, don't just download a K off a back file and like read it in round. Like, you want to engage with the literature. Also, think about your social location before you read certain arguments. White people should not be reading Afro-pessimism. Um, things along those lines. White people should not make ontological claims about the status of Black people, that kind of thing. Be careful about it. Talk to people who know more about you before you read an argument, who know more than you before you read an argument. Anything else, or should we move on?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, really quickly, just so we can wrap this up, for understanding a K-neg, here are some similar tips and strategies. Like I said before, a K is just another type of argument. Like, just keep an open mind. For answering Ks, I've color-coded some example responses to a cap K, which is a critique of capitalism. Blue is, I guess, like a more defensive response, and then yellow is probably like offense. I I don't think it matters in so much as like your cohesive strategy against the K should be one that you feel very comfortable going for, and that every single K is going to function differently. Every single K debater is going to go for something different or understand and articulate their critique a little bit differently, and so it's always good to be flexible. Um, but yeah, on the link level, it is probably good to do some work here where we can say that you don't perpetuate capitalism in this example, or that the app is actually good for resisting capitalism for whatever reason. Um, on the impact level, we can always turn the impact. We can say that things like capitalism are good, or securitization rhetoric or threat construction is good for XYZ reasons. This is the obligatory part of the lecture where I say that we shouldn't impact turn certain things like racism, sexism, queerphobia, or genocide. I think it is probably good for us to gut check these things and to figure out when we shouldn't be impact turning things, especially not claims of specific violence or forms of violence that happen against people. Yeah, it is generally good to recognize when it's probably best to go for work on the link and the perm instead of like an impact turn. Also, yeah, please don't double turn yourself. This is pretty standard. Yeah, on the alt, um, this is where you can do a lot of the work, especially in pressing K teams to explain their alt and what that alt looks like. Because more often than not, a lot of K debaters who are still unfamiliar with their literature may not be fully confident or able to explain what the alt does. And that is probably where you should be going for when you are responding to a K. You can explain that the alt doesn't solve, or it's not a strong or good solution, or you can explain that the alt is independently bad for XYZ reasons, or that is harmful for XYZ reasons, i.e. you can say that the alt excludes or actively marginalizes certain groups in that it fails to consider them in its method, or that it is exclusionary in its method. One additional argument you can use is something called a permutation or a perm. So what a perm is, it is a test of competition to see if we can do the alt and the AF. And this is a really strong argument to make against the alt because it means that there's no reason to vote independently on the K. Because if the alt is not competitive or exclusive with doing the AF, then there is no reason as to why I should be negating on the K. There are different types of perms. The most common one is just like a 3-word like perm do both, which is A, underdeveloped, B, underwarranted, and C, insufficient for me to be voting on a perm, which is why your perm should be articulated very clearly as to why perm plus case is either better than just a K, why perm plus case means that the K is no longer unique or an independent reason to vote, along with why perm plus case is just uniquely capable of doing more or doing better than what the critique alt is advocating for. And so what this looks like is, and if you can card your perms, that'd be really great. But if we can say things like perm, do the alt in the mindset of the AF, i.e. is an example where we can articulate that engaging in historical materialism from a queer pedagogy or from a queer framework is much better than just, this alt. And so what it comes down to is one really cohesive strategy against Ks is just doing link work and then going for like multiple perms. And so what this looks like is putting a lot of defense on the link because every single link that goes uncontested will always be a disadvantage to the perm to doing the AF and the alt at the same time. So yeah, after you do your link work, you should be going to the alt and then just reading multiple perms or explaining why the K is not mutually exclusive. But yeah, as with every single K, like the strategy probably changes and is in no way a cohesive like go-to plan for every single critique. I would urge you to keep your mind open and to think about multiple ways in which you can respond to and handle these types of arguments.
Yeah, and just really quickly, everything Anya just mentioned is just another reason why I said earlier, you really need to understand your literature base when you read critiques. A lot of the answers to these kinds of arguments are just going to be, they misunderstood X. If you understand your literature base more than your opponent, you will usually win.
Yeah, and then specifically some further listening and reading. For when you don't have that same literature-based advantage as your opponent, there's always this really good lecture by Bill Batterman from SDI called Answering Unfamiliar Critiques. It is really, really useful for giving you a go-to way to categorize and understand certain parts of a K. I personally found it pretty useful. And it is also just like, it helps for literature disparities, especially when your opponent has been reading like one section of the library for like the past 4 years of their career. And so they really, really understand AfroPes, and maybe you have never debated AfroPes before. And so it's always good to come into the round with some base foundations, or at least some tools in your toolkit that you feel comfortable using in K rounds. Additionally, there is the Intro to the K by Hunter McFarland. This is also really useful, especially if you'd like another way to review critical debate. I think it is geared for policy debaters though, so some of the terminology may just be inapplicable or not cross-applicable to debate for a PF. Yeah, and then there's also OpenEv, which I think we mentioned before, but always really useful to read camp files and to read K files from Policy Camp. Just looking through different literature and seeing how it interacts with different resolutions will give you a better understanding of how K links and K AFs function. And then lastly, outside of high school debate, there is Dr. Reed Brinkley's dissertation about policy debate and how the Louisville Project influenced performance debate. It is incredibly important and definitely influenced the way in which I understand and interact with debate. If there's anything you get from this lecture, it is that I strongly recommend that you read through this PDF at some point.
Okay, that's the lecture. I hope you enjoyed. Obviously, this was not exhaustive. Critiques are a massive idea that people have been working on for years and years. if you have any questions, wondering where to go for further reading, need help with something you're working on, we're available. We don't bite. We're on Facebook, and you can email us at those addresses. Um, yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing now. Okay, I hope you all enjoyed. Bye.